This Dharma, incomparably profound and minutely subtle, is rarely encountered, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of ages. Now we see it, hear it, hold and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning.
So this is another Heart Sutra talk. Quick review of what we have so far. The first part that we did was a prologue, which is a part that we do not chant. And in this prologue, the sutra is set up. We have Buddha and we have Avalokiteshvara, both in deep meditation. He's somehow transmitting wisdom to her through this wordless meditation thing. And Avalokiteshvara declares a new teaching on emptiness. The audience listening to this preaching, various monks and bodhisattvas, and importantly, Shariputra, who's a faithful practitioner or a loser, depending on what descriptions of him you read. And it's Shariputra who kind of sets up the sutra by asking a question. After Avalokiteshvara, it said, this is the part that we chant, Avalokiteshvara, doing deep prajna paramita, clearly saw emptiness of all the five conditions, thus completely relieving misfortune and pain. So Shariputra hears this new teaching.
Pat, they can't hear you.
What's the problem then? Oh, because I have it in my pocket?
I think the batteries died.
The batteries died, oh great. All right, they'll just come here. Yes? Let's take this away then. I think we don't have too many
Just
people.
3? Okay.
That's good. So you didn't miss much. This was just a review, a few lines of review. So Shariputra asked this question. He says, okay, this new teaching that you're giving us, how is it that we can practice to gain this wisdom and to use it in our practice? So this is the sutra as we chant it is Avalokiteshvara's answer to Shariputra. And this is why in the part that we chant, occasionally this mysterious thing says, oh, Shariputra, and we don't know who he is, but if we read the prologue, we do know. So, Avalokiteshvara during deep prajna paramita clearly saw the emptiness of all the five conditions, thus relieving misfortune and pain. So we spent a lot of time on the five conditions, also sometimes called the five aggregates. And we dug into these, trying to understand how it is that they operate in our lives. The sutra analyzes our senses and the mental processes that we use to interpret the data of the senses, and how these contribute to our false perception that form is solid and unchanging. So these are the five conditions that are doing this. We'll talk about them more specifically as we go along. So what the sutra concludes is that not only do these six senses give us incomplete information and biased information, but that all the mental processes we use to interpret what we're getting from the five senses, what this means, that these are complicit in giving us false information. So one of the major points of the past talks was to talk about these five aggregates, six senses, which cause us to see. Now, here's what the sutra is talking about. It causes us to see what is empty as real in a way that it isn't. None of what we see is solid and real in exactly the same way we think it is. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's not real in the way we take it in from the senses and our mental processes. So then after Avalokiteshvara does this, she starts to go into this emptiness a little more. She says, "Oh, Shariputra, form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness no other than form. Form is exactly emptiness. Emptiness exactly form." So this is the heart of the Heart Sutra, talking about emptiness and the identity of emptiness and form. We talked a lot about this. Now, the next line, she goes on to say sensation, conception, discrimination, awareness are likewise like this. So what's happening here is Shariputra is delineating the five aggregates for us. So form is the first aggregate. It's the most obvious one. It's the material one. And so she talks a lot about form, but then goes on to say the other four aggregates: sensation, conception, discrimination, awareness. These are also the aggregates, but these are not material. These are the mental processes that we use to interpret what we're taking in from the senses. I mean, we all know, just take the example of how in police work lineups, people are trying to identify the person they saw and how often that goes awry. You know, they're not necessarily lying, they're just mistaken. They didn't see what they thought they saw. And so this is true of all of us. We all see in our own particular way. We don't always see what's there. And then we start to interpret it through all these mental processes and life experiences and prejudices and biases and all that. And so what we get is not necessarily true. And according to Buddhism, of course, what we get is that we think it's all real and it's solid. So what the sutra is trying to disabuse us of is this impression we get from the five aggregates. And Shariputra is saying, no, it's not solid and real. It's empty. Okay. Let's see where we are here. So then Shariputra goes on to say, Avalokiteshvara goes on to say, "Oh, Shariputra, all dharmas are forms of emptiness, not born, not destroyed, not stained, not pure." So what this is talking about here is that if the thing itself, if the information we're getting, if the form is empty, then all possible qualities that it might have are also empty. So it can't be born, it can't be destroyed. So what it's basically saying, that's birth and death, basically, according to Buddhism. So it's saying, no, nothing is born and nothing dies. It can't be stained, it can't be pure. How could it have a quality? It's empty. The stained and pure are like preoccupations with Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism. They're very concerned with being pure. and they have various interpretations of what that might be. A really orthodox Theravada monks would not handle money, for example. That would be impure. When I was at the monastery, we used to have these visits from Theravada monks once in a while. And when they found out that inside the monastery were women, they wouldn't come in because they're not allowed to be under the same roof as women. So all these like very material interpretations they have of what's pure and impure. If they read this, they'd realize, oh, it can't be. It's all empty anyway, so how could it be pure or impure? But of course, that's a whole nother story. And it goes on to say, without loss, without gain. So you cannot lose anything, and you cannot gain anything. This is a major thing in Buddhism, no gain. And later in the sutra it says no gain, and thus the bodhisattva lives prajnaparamita. Barry is always talking about no gain. A lot of students get very bent out of shape because they don't know why they're practicing if they're not getting anything out of it. But what the sutra's telling us is forget that. It can't have a quality if it doesn't exist in the first place. I'm having to refer to my text here of the sutra a little bit. So again, the sutra repeats these other aggregates. Again, so in emptiness, there is no form, no sensation, no conception, no discrimination, no awareness. None of these things operate because if there's nothing there to perceive, there's nothing there to interpret anyway. So then goes on to say, he says, Avalokitesvara, sensation, conception, discrimination are likewise like this, or also like this. So what does it mean by like this? It means it's like form, it's empty. So then he's continuing again to review these aggregates, which play a very important role in this sutra. And first he lists the six senses. No eye, no ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, no color, sound, smell, taste, phenomena. So listing the senses. Remember that in Buddhism, there are six senses, not five, and that the sixth sense is mind. Mind is included as a sense because as its role in interpreting the sensory data, which we just talked about, you're not just getting raw data, it's also being filtered through all these mind processes. So the sutra has already established that the senses are empty. Because when Avalokitesvara saw the emptiness of the five conditions, the senses were included in this as part of the aggregates, though he does not mention them specifically there. And despite what we think, the data that we get is always relative. It's never the same for two people, and it's never the same for us day to day. So then, after naming the actual senses, the sutra goes on to talk about what we experience through the senses. So it says no color. Where am I here? No color, sound, smell, taste, touch, phenomena. And it's just correlating each of these, of what we get from each of the senses. Color from the eyes, sound from the ears, smell from the nose, taste from the tongue, touch from the body, and phenomena is what he's, Avalokiteshvara is saying here, that we get from the mind. I'm not sure why he calls it phenomenon, but that's the correlation. So what the sutra is saying here is all of these are empty as well. And logically they would have to be. So if the organs reporting these qualities are empty, then the qualities have to be empty too. So having said this, Avalokiteshvara turns to a list of negations. There's a whole list in here of negations, and says no ignorance, and no end to ignorance, no old age and death, and no end to old age and death. So this brings us to the core of the portion that we're going to talk about today. What you want to know about these lists, from now on there'll be a lot of lists. I mean, we've already had eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and all that. So now we're having more lists of abstract words. And the thing to know about these lists is that they're not just random things. They sound just like, Buddhist words. But they're all talking about something very specific, and I'm going to tell you what those things are. So when the sutra says no ignorance and no end to ignorance, no old age and death, and no end to old age and death, it's referring to the 12-fold chain of origination, or what sometimes called in Buddhism, dependent arising. So this is a very ancient Buddhist teaching. It comes from the very original writings of Buddhism. And it's a bulwark of Buddhist doctrine. And here the sutra says no. So what the 12-fold chain, it's kind of complicated, but I'll explain to you the best I can, simplify it a little. The 12-fold chain of origination is the Buddhist explanation of how we get into so much trouble in the world in the first place. The chain describes how step by step we get hooked in a cycle of suffering, birth, and death. Don't forget that, traditionally, the aim of Buddhism is to end the cycle of birth and death. We don't see it in quite that same way, most of us these days. But that was the original, very literal aim. So how does Buddhism propose to do this? By ending ignorance. In ignorance, you're enlightened. No birth, no death. So the first step in the chain of 12-fold origination is ignorance. This is a kind of primal ignorance, our ignorance of emptiness. We see things as permanent and separate because we hold to mistaken ideas about the information of the senses. We think things are solid and real. So out of this ignorance of emptiness, a whole chain of mistaken ideas arises. And what those ideas lead to are the feeling that we are, that we exist. That, Buddhism would say that there's an ego. So we think we're permanent. And because of this, birth and death arise. Death is the inevitable result of birth. This is the 12-fold chain of origination. We build up this whole house of cards about reality based on the original ignorance that we have about permanence. So here the sutra digs into this and negates the first step in the chain, a 12-fold chain, ignorance. This is no ignorance. I mean, this would seemingly negate the whole point of Buddhism, right? Both this 12-fold chain and the Buddha suggest that our problem is our ignorance, sometimes called delusion. So what are we ignorant of? Of what is real. We are told that to walk the way is how we will end our ignorance and wake up to the truth. But here in the sutra, we're told that not only is there no ignorance, but there's no end to ignorance. So to understand this claim, we need to remember that Avalokiteshvara is making this statement from the point of view of emptiness. So if everything is empty, ignorance is also empty. And the end of ignorance is also empty. Neither can be possible. And when Buddha talked from the point of view of emptiness, now in the four noble truths, Buddha does talk about ignorance and ending ignorance and all that. But when he talks from the point of view of emptiness, which is right after his enlightenment, he also indicates that there's no ignorance. What did he say? He said all sentient beings and I are inherently Buddha. So there's no ignorance. We all have Buddha nature. We're already wise. We've already achieved prajnaparamita. So this is the premise of Buddha's emptiness. We're perfect just the way we are, as Suzuki Roshi says. So this next line finishes the negations of the 12-fold chain of origination by claiming that if the first step, no ignorance, is true, then the last step, old age and death, are empty. It says no old age and death, but then it adds no end to old age and death. So once we step on the path of ignorance, suffering is inevitable. The truth that everything changes leads finally to old age and death. And that's the great boogeyman of all humans, right? Death. And it results because in our ignorance, we don't see that the self is empty. And if it's empty, then therefore it can neither be born nor die. But what about the second part of the statement? No end to old age and death. This is the part that we love to read and cling to. But the line does not mean that the body and individual self doesn't get old and die. It just means that from the point of view of emptiness, we can't die. Because where is that self who can be said to die? So these two opposite claims are in direct contradiction. Why does Avalokiteshvara make them? In the next line, the series of opposite claims continues. It's how the Heart Sutra looks at things from this new perspective gained from seeing emptiness, and how it looks at the point of view, from the point of view of the relative. Because remember, Avalokiteshvara says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. You can't leave form out. So Avalokiteshvara here is nodding once again to the core claim of the sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. He reminds us once again that there are two ways of looking at reality. We can look at it from the point of view of the ordinary relative world, or we can look at it from the point of view of emptiness or the absolute. Both points of view are valid, but what we see will be different depending on which point of view we're viewing things from. These contradictory statements illustrate how important the insight of emptiness is in Buddhism and in your own personal realization, of course. It's important because it totally turns upside down and inside out the ordinary ways in which you see things. In the next lines, Avalokita once again embraces contradictory statements as a way to express his understanding. I read them to you. He goes on to say, no suffering, no cause of suffering, no extinguishing, no path, no wisdom, and no gain. Now here he started on a whole new demolishment of Buddhist doctrine. He's talking here about the Four Noble Truths. Now, these Four Noble Truths are the absolutely indispensable teaching of the Buddha. After his, they were his first teachings after his enlightenment. First of all, he says, I'm not going to teach because this experience I've had is so ineffable that nobody will get it. I'm just going to sit around and enjoy my enlightenment and, look at the flowers. But then he met up with some of his old companions who meditated with him. And they look at him and they see he's like totally transformed, if we had a movie, he'd be glowing or something. So they ask him, what happened, Siddhartha? What's changed? And so he decides, okay, out of compassion, he'll teach them. He goes to the deer park, which is like a big open space. You can still visit this, and if you go to India, it's a big tourist spot. You can go to the deer park and visit where Buddha gave his first sermon. And what he said was the Four Noble Truths. What these Four Noble Truths are describing, okay, this is what I saw when I got enlightened, this is what I realized. So in the truths, he acknowledges the suffering of human life. And he felt that this suffering was a result of constant change and churn in life. The human tendency not to acknowledge change caused humans to desire to hold on to things and treat them as though they were permanent. So this is the basis of human suffering as Buddha sees it. This tendency to hold on, Buddha calls desire. Desire for what isn't, and desire to be rid of what is that you don't like. So, What the sutra here is negating are the insights of the Four Noble Truths. So Avalokita now says there is no suffering. There is no cause of suffering. This change and this churn that's causing you all this anxiety doesn't exist. So how can this be? After again, the sutra is looking at things from the point of view of emptiness. If everything is empty, then there is no self. So who would there be to suffer? What would there be to cause suffering? So the negating of the Four Noble Truths continues on in the sutra. Avalokiteshvara says, no extinguishing, no path, no wisdom, and no gain. So the Buddha goes on to teach in the Four Noble Truths that humans can end their suffering. And he lays out a clear path for how that might occur. It's called the Eightfold Path. And so when the sutra claims there's no extinguishing, no way, it's directly contradicting the Buddhist claim that we can end suffering and that there is an extinguishing. Extinguishing is actually a sort of close English translation of the word nirvana, blowing out the candle, extinguishing. What we blow out in enlightenment is the idea of the self. So this sutra is saying, no, forget all that, that's not existing. No path, no wisdom, no gain. So the Eightfold Path, which the Buddha sets out in the Four Noble Truths, is negated. And the promise of the path is that humans will gain wisdom, but that's also negated. If we take this only at face value, it's very discouraging news. Not only is there no path, but if there were, why would we take it? Because you won't gain anything anyhow. And here you all are, little Buddhists sitting around on your mats. Once again, we need to remember that Avalokiteshvara is intoxicated with his insight about the emptiness of all the five conditions. This is new. This is a newbie enlightened person. They tend to get overly enthusiastic. And from this point of view, all of the Buddha's earnest preachings would be just words. They would be empty of meaning, and they would be describing a world which doesn't conform to the reality of the world that the Buddha is actually talking about, which is the world of realization, of enlightenment, of emptiness. It isn't that the Buddha doesn't know about the world of emptiness. Of course he does. That's what he saw. It's just that he's trying to communicate in the Four Noble Truths with an audience which doesn't yet know this world. And when they do know it, they too will see that his words are only the proverbial raft which Buddhists are supposed to take across to the other side and then discard. So when we see the emptiness of all things, a funny thing happens. We see the fullness and the wholeness of all things. So what's left when things are empty? Everything. The whole universe in all its fullness is left. The world becomes palpable for the first time, and we really live on this earth. So to answer Shariputra's question, the sutra says this, that you must see the emptiness of everything. If you do this, you can find a way out of suffering. And the rest of the sutra goes on to embroider this short answer. It tells us that once we see the emptiness of everything, we will also see that what we call form is not different from emptiness, nor is emptiness possible without form. Then what we will see is what Dojin Cook says in How to Raise an Ox. We'll see the world in all its homely glory, somehow putting together emptiness with form brings forth form in a new way to us. So that is all the lines I'm going to talk about today, and next time we will be, this section that we covered today is probably the most complex and the most difficult section of the sutra because so many terms and so on. But we will be going on next time to talk about the last, say, third of the sutra. He immediately follows this section we talked about today with no gain, and thus the bodhisattva lives prajna paramita, with no hindrance in the mind. No hindrance, therefore no fear. Far beyond deluded thoughts, this is nirvana. All past, present, and future Buddhas live prajna paramita. We'll talk about this prajna paramita and what it is. And therefore attain anuttara samyak sambodhi. Therefore know prajna paramita is the great mantra, the vivid mantra, the best mantra, the unsurpassable mantra. It completely clears all pain. This is the truth, not a lie. I always like it that it backs up its statement by telling us it's true, underlining it. So set forth the prajna paramita mantra. Set forth this mantra and say, Gate, Gate, Para Gate, Parasam Gate, Bodhisvaha, Prajna Heart Sutra. So we'll try to talk about those lines next time. We're coming to the final lines of the sutra. I hope that was helpful. I had a big computer craziness yesterday at the 11th hour on Saturday, and I lost all my notes in the computer and I couldn't get them back, and so it was a little rough. Forgive me.